Now we continue to digest the meaning of yesterday's budget and how it fits into the bigger context of where we are as a country. The biggest allocation or piece of the pie goes to social services. And we've been talking about the fact that almost half of South Africans rely on some form of grant to survive. But the lion's share of social services, that's when we talk about education. The question, as always, is what's the point of spending if it doesn't always produce results? We're joined now by equal education researcher Jane Borman for more on this. Thank you so much for being with us, Ms. Borman. Before we even talk about quality education, you were concerned ahead of the budget about pit toilets. Incredibly, we still have pit toilets. The issues have moved on, but this issue remains. How bad is the situation right now?
Well, the reality is that 28 years, 29 years after the end of democracy, the fact that, government has not been able to make sure that all schools have safe and dignified toilets is really is something that, is just absolutely terrible and something that we think is completely unacceptable. You have some schools that have only plain pit toilets. Those are schools that have no other form of sanitation. And that is still in the thousands of when we're talking about numbers of schools. Then you have schools that may have, two different types of toilets, but still have these dangerous plain pit toilets that are used. And those schools, again, rack up in the thousands. So you have many, many learners across the country who are still faced with the complete indignity of having to use these dangerous forms of sanitation.
And what is the problem here? Is not enough money being allocated to education as a whole, or within education, is it not being distributed rationally and really for the dignity of those children? Is it just being misspent? I mean, where is the gap that we find ourselves here?
I think there are a number of gaps. And, unfortunately, it's a case that we have to move forward with tackling all of these issues at the same time in order to be able to properly tackle the issue as a whole. Firstly, we do have a serious spending issue. Now, this isn't just in basic education. We see this across government, but it is something that completely hampers the ability for us to use the money that is already allocated in an efficient way, whether it's irregular spending or whether it's wasteful spending or simply not having the capacity in the departments to spend the money that is given. This is a huge, huge issue. I mean, we see now in certain provinces, they have actually had some of their school infrastructure funding taken away from them because they have shown that they're not capable of spending it. These provinces are often the provinces that need this kind of school infrastructure the most. And so that is deeply concerning. But on the top of that, we can't simply say that, well, because the money is not spent well, we need to cut funding to basic education, because that can't be the solution to the problem, because who in the end suffers? It's the children. And we still, while we tackle the issue of spending, we need to see funding allocations to basic education keep up with inflation, but also learner enrollment. Every year we have more children entering the school system. And that means that unless we are providing funding that keeps up with inflation and keeps up with learner enrollment, every year learners will be getting fewer resources and fewer support from government.
And that's interesting, because we always look at how big the allocation is to education, but you say in terms of allocation per actual student, it's going down. Do we benchmark against the rest of the world in terms of spending on education, and then look at the outcomes as well? We know that we have very poor literacy and numeracy rates.
I think that one of the big issues, it's hard. Obviously, it's important to compare, basic education funding and outcome to other countries, but we also have to take our unique context into consideration. 1994, the incoming government was faced with an education system that, on the one hand, there were a few number of schools that were white-only schools that were well-resourced, but the majority of the education system was completely under-resourced and didn't have many of the bare minimum basic infrastructure pieces in place. And so there was a huge task in front of government, and government will have to have spent more than perhaps other countries that had a more level playing field in order to be able to make sure that, the vast majority of schools in our country are able to catch up to the small minority of schools that are functioning. So we do have a very unique situation on our hands. I do feel, public schools are across the country. There are millions of learners that attend these schools. And so the reality is that this will have to be a huge spending item based on the size of basic education system. Within that, I think there is a very important conversation that must be had around how we spend the amount that we are spending is not equating to outcomes that we should be getting for the amount that we are spending. But it is tough to compare to other countries because, different countries are faced with different set of circumstances that, obviously, mean that they have to spend their money in a different way and spend their money in targeting different areas.
Thank you. You're right. Our historical context is so unique. And maybe we can talk about those outcomes, perhaps the lack of quality sometimes in future. That was equal education researcher Jane Borman. Thank you very much.